Frances Elena Farmer was born on September 19th, 1913, in Seattle, Washington, to her mother Cora Lillian and her father Ernest Melvin Farmer. Her parents had married in 1906 and had two other children before Frances. Her father was a lawyer and her mother ran a boarding house. Ernest Farmer was described as being ineffectual, while his wife Cora was quite the opposite and described as a determined and hard-willed woman. In the early 1920s, the Farmer family would move to a bungalow in West Seattle as Ernest's career in law began to decline. Subsequently, Frances' parents would begin to have problems and their marriage would fall apart. Her parents would separate when she was a preteen, and Frances and her siblings would end up staying with their mother in Los Angeles and later in Chico, California. Cora would begin a career in nutrition research in early 1925, which she felt she didn't have time for both her career and to raise her children, so she had her sister drive the kids to a train that took them back to Seattle to live with their father. The trip back to Frances' father's home was said to be a life-changing one for the young teen, as she began to realize, quote, that there were certain things that one could expect from adults and others that one could not. A year later, Cora's house would burn down, and as a result, she'd have to move back in with her estranged husband. And despite his attempts to reconcile their marriage, the two finalized the divorce in 1929 when Frances was just 16 years old. Frances would attend West Seattle High School. She was described as a lonely, bookish child that had a talent for performing. Her mother made sure to put her in voice and piano lessons to keep busy, and Frances would appear on stage for the first time alongside her older sister, Edith, in a church operetta titled The Pirate's Daughter. Frances stood taller than her peers and exuded charisma and also had a radiant smile. It was apparent to some that she had an amazing talent for acting and had potential to become a star. Also, while in high school, Frances was considered a champion debater and a very skilled writer. She maintained her grades and qualified to become a member of the Honor Society, and as a senior in April of 1931, she wrote an essay as part of a contest that was sponsored by the Scholastic. Frances won the contest and would also receive $100, which would be around $2,000 today, and it would get her some notoriety. Her essay was titled God Dies, which, as you could imagine, was extremely controversial back in 1931. The essay would make headlines around the whole country, and the media would say things like, "Seattle girl denies God and wins prize." Church affiliates would also say, "If the young people of this city are going to hell, Frances Farmer is surely leading them there." Frances would go on to say that the reaction to her essay was a turning point for her in her life. She said, quote, "It was sad because for the first time in my life, I realized how stupid people could be. It made me feel alone in the world. The more people pointed at me in scorn, the more stubborn I got. And when they began calling me the bad girl of West Seattle High, I tried to live up to it." Frances would start college at the University of Washington in September of 1931 and would hold many jobs to get herself through it. She worked as a tutor, an usher at Paramount Theater, and a singing waitress at Mount Rainier National Park. She majored in drama, and in her sophomore year, she starred in several plays that would get her citywide recognition. Frances dreamed of going to New York to further her acting career, but with her family struggling financially, it just didn't seem possible. A solution to their financial problems would come about in her final year in college. Frances began selling subscription newspapers to the leftist company called The Voice of Action. Frances would win a prize from the company, which included an all-paid trip to New York and also to the Soviet Union. Many people, including her own mother, would say that she had been corrupted by communism and would advise her to not take the trip. Frances herself would tell everyone that she didn't want to study communism, but rather go to study Russian theater. Frances returned to New York in the summer of 1935. She met a few talent agents that would get her a 7-year contract with Paramount Pictures. She would then move to Los Angeles and would star in her first movie called Too Many Parents, which was a box office success. Around that time, she began dating and married a fellow actor by the name of Leif Erikson. The marriage was described as an unhappy one, unfortunately, though, and they would ultimately get divorced. By the end of 1935, Frances had starred in 4 different movies, slowly moving from smaller parts to bigger roles. Her most critically acclaimed film would come in 1936 when she played a young woman who would be pursued by her mother's lover in a movie titled Come and Get It. Frances played 2 roles in the film, one being a world-weary cabaret singer and a virginal daughter. Frances would be flown back to her hometown to Seattle, but this time she was returning as a star. She drove through the town in a limo, and as fans crowded around to get a glimpse of her, she took in all of the success and paparazzi. Frances was described as cold and aloof at the premiere, and she was, didn't really talk to anyone except for the people she knew. In 1937, Frances would begin to hate the Hollywood life. She made 3 films that year and was becoming increasingly hard to work with, which was a result of her not liking what the directors of her movies were turning her characters into. She also didn't like that the Hollywood studios would often attempt to glamorize her private life, and midway through 1937, she would begin her transition into acting into theater plays, which was her original goal as an actress to begin with. Imminently, she would star in her first big play titled Golden Boy, which was written by Clifford O'Day. The play would last 3 months long and eventually began touring the U.S. the following year in 1938. During this time, Frances would begin a romantic affair with O'Day, although he was still married to another actress named Louise Rayner. He would never commit to Frances, and she began to feel used by the whole production crew of Golden Boy. And as a result, Frances returned to Los Angeles and would star in a few more plays and movies, but would begin drinking heavily as a way to cope with depression. This would lead her to withdraw from a Broadway she had been working on called The Fifth Column. She would be fined $1,500 by the Theater Guild for unprofessionalism. On top of her drinking, she began smoking cigarettes and also using amphetamines as she felt her life was in a downward spiral. Back then, amphetamines was used as an appetite suppressant and wasn't known to be harmful or highly addictive as we now know today. Now, in the early 1940s, Frances starred in countless movies and plays, but that's when she would begin to have legal trouble. On the night of October 19th, 1942, Frances was pulled over in Santa Monica. The officer that stopped her, he arrested her for drunk driving and driving without a license, and she was fined $250 and was sentenced to 180 days in jail. She paid half the fine and went to Mexico, where she started working on an independent film, but ultimately she was sent back to the U.S. after being drunk and disorderly for 2 weeks straight. When she returned home, she found that her mother and her sister-in-law moved all of her belongings from the fancy bungalow she was living in into a cheap hotel, as she was told that she was beginning to run low on money. In early 1943, Frances was working on a low-budget film called No Escape, and on the first day of filming, she ended up slapping a hairdresser so hard that the hairdresser fell to the ground with a dislocated jaw. As a result, Frances would have charges pressed against her and would be arrested at the Knickerbocker Hotel, where she would struggle very hard against the cops that were trying to take her in. She struggled so hard that apparently she was naked as they were taking her out of the hotel. And in court, Frances was obnoxious. The judge found that she had a warrant for her arrest, and she was asked if she had anything to drink since her last appearance in court. She began yelling things like, quote, "Yes, I drink everything I can get, including Benzedrine. I was fighting for my country and myself. Have you ever had a broken heart?" She was sentenced to serve her original 180 days in jail without permission to call a lawyer. Police officers began taking her away, but she would put up a fight. One officer was knocked to the ground and a couple of others were bruised up in the altercation. Frances would only spend 1 night in jail before her family got a psychiatrist involved. She would be transferred to a psych ward at the Los Angeles General Hospital and would be diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis. She spent several months going between different facilities and would ultimately end up at the San Fernando Valley Institute. There she was diagnosed as being a paranoid schizophrenic, and supposedly Frances was given insulin shock therapy for 90 consecutive days, which caused her extreme stomach pain and nausea. Her mother, Cora, began a very lengthy battle with the courts in California to obtain formal guardianship over Frances. September of 1943, Frances moved back with her mom in West Seattle. You'd figure things would calm down a bit between the two at this point, but that was definitely not the case. Frances and her mother would often argue and fight physically, so her mother, Cora, would have her admitted again, this time to the Western State Hospital in Steilacoom, Washington. Frances would go on to say that she and the other patients there would receive shock treatment therapy, and people there speculated that lobotomies were performed as well. In July of 1944, Frances was pronounced completely cured from her mental illnesses and was released back into her mother's custody, but soon thereafter she was arrested yet again for vagrancy. Frances eventually would move to Nevada to live with her father, and in May of 1945, Cora, her mother, filed a sanity hearing for Frances. She was commuted back to the Western State Hospital for 5 years, where she was held in a maximum security unit because she constantly would act violent. But I mean, hell, who wouldn't go crazy after having gone through everything she did at this point? Upon her release from the Western State Hospital in 1953, she had her mother's conservatorship removed by the court. She was finally free from the grips of her mother and began working at the Olympic Hotel, the same hotel where her movie Come and Get It had premiered. She would begin dating a 45-year-old utility worker by the name of Alfred H. Lobley. The two would get married in April of 1954 and would begin living with her mother, Cora, as her mental health had taken a rapid decline. Frances sent her mother to a nursing home a year later, as her marriage began to crumble, and her mother would die from a stroke in March of 1955. Unfortunately, her father would also die of the same cause a year later in 1956, and in 1957, Frances would finalize her divorce from Alfred and move to Eureka, California, where she found work as a bookkeeper. There, she met an independent broadcast promoter by the name of Leland Markshow, who was from Indianapolis. He envisioned a comeback for Frances and her acting career, and the two would get married soon after that in 1958. Frances would go on to appear on The Ed Sullivan Show, where she played guitar and sang the folk song Aura Lee. She also would appear on This Is Your Life, where she would talk about her supposed alcoholism with host Ralph Edwards.
Well, Ralph, in the first place, I want to be able to tell something of my own experiences to help people who have, I know, been in the same kind of predicament. I received so many letters. People who want hope or advice, even, which perhaps I can suggest where they can find it.
Yes.
It's that sort of thing that I wanted to do for them and for myself. I would very much like to correct some impressions which arose out of a lot of stories that were written about me, I guess, but they weren't about me. They're suggesting things that I could possibly have been doing, which I never did. I wasn't in a position to defend myself at the time these stories were published, and I'm very happy to be here tonight to let people see that I am the kind of person I am and not a legend that arose.
Right.
Frances would return to the stage to star in the play The Chalk Garden, and also starred in a film called The Party Crashers. Her comeback to acting allowed her to start her own show called Frances Farmer Presents, which was broadcasted on the television station WFBM TV, which is now known as WRTV in Indianapolis. In March of 1959, news went around that Frances and Leland Mikesell separated, as he was trying to sue her for a breach of contract.
All this affection that I've given you apparently scares the shit out of you.
Her divorce from Mikesell was finalized in 1963. She moved in with a friend named Jean Ratcliffe, who was a widow that Frances had become good friends with after moving to Indianapolis. Frances would continue doing her show Frances Farmer Presents, which would ultimately be canceled in the summer of 1964 because of her supposed drinking binges. She continued doing plays for Purdue Theater, and while driving to a production for a play called The Visit, Frances was involved in a drunk driving crash. She began acting as a character from one of her plays and began yelling at the cops who were not pleased and took her to jail. She was nervous to go back to acting in anything, but was encouraged by Jean Ratcliffe. And during the early to mid-1960s, Frances spent a lot of her time in Indianapolis just writing poems and painting. Frances would convert to Roman Catholicism in the late 60s and was heavily involved in the St. Joan of Arc Church. During this time, she was able to give up her drinking altogether and began collaborating with fellow actress Lois Kibbe, who encouraged her to tape record her life story, as it was an interesting one. As Frances would begin documenting her life, she was overcome with emotion while revisiting the thoughts and medical records of her institutional days. In spring of 1970, Frances would be diagnosed with esophageal cancer, which was a result of all her years of heavy smoking. She was hospitalized for 3 weeks before being discharged and returning home, which Frances would soon after be hospitalized yet again at the Indianapolis Community Hospital. On August 1st, 1970, Frances would succumb to the fatal cancer. Jean Ratcliffe took what Frances recorded and finished it for her. She released an autobiography called Will There Really Be a Morning? The book, over time, was proved to have some exaggerated stories, especially the one about the lobotomies at Western State Hospital, which a lot of people believed back then, including famous musician Kurt Cobain, who wrote a song about the famous actress and aptly named it "Frances Farmer Will Have Her Revenge on Seattle."
They basically just set her up and ruined her life. It was a big, huge scandal, and she eventually was sent to a mental institution and given a lobotomy and raped every day for years, and just totally abused, and ended up like working at a Four Seasons restaurant alone and dying by herself.
Her remains are in a mausoleum at the Oaklawn Memorial Gardens Cemetery in Fishers, Indiana. I actually took a trip earlier this year to Fishers, and while I was there, I went to the mausoleum to pay respect to the late great actress Frances Farmer.
You came in my life and saved me from myself, but you're living a lie and it knocked me to the ground. You came in.
But there you have it. That's the turbulent life of Frances Farmer. And, every people say she was crazy. I mean, I feel like had she had been around these days, she probably would have led a better life, as we have more of an understanding of mental illness, and doctors know how to treat it more than they did back then. So, hope you like this video, and please like, share, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Also, thanks to all the people who have subscribed already and have been supporting me for over the past year. I'll see you on the next video. Take care.